Stanford University.
So I wanted to very, very warmly welcome you to the first in the 6 lectures that we will have this year in the award-winning Teachers on Teaching series. Because this is the 99th lecture in the series, we're very excited that the series has shown this incredible longevity, that it's going stronger than ever. And above all, that Professor of English, Michele Elam, who is the Martin Luther King Jr. Centennial Professor, has agreed to start off the series this year. And I hope she doesn't mind, I didn't have a chance to check this with her, I hope she doesn't mind if I mention that her husband, the Vice Provost for Undergraduate Education, Harry J. Elam Jr., will be delivering the 100th lecture next Tuesday, November 9th at 4 o'clock in the Bechtel Conference Center as part of CTL's 35th anniversary celebration, and the best way I can think of to celebrate our anniversary. So, hope that was okay, Michele. Okay. As you're no doubt all aware, Michele will be addressing us today on the topic of the new F word, and thank goodness that's feminism, and beyond, gender, race, and other classroom unspeakables, a complicated and challenging nexus of topics that we're very happy she's willing to tackle, and certainly something that she is eminently qualified to speak on. After getting her bachelor's from UCSD and also a master's in English from the University of Washington, Michele completed a PhD with honors in English and ethnic studies, also at the University of Washington in 1992. Her dissertation on the racial politics of love, reimagining the mulatta, 1850 to 1920, which won the Robert Heilman Dissertation Prize, prefigured both the nature of her interests and her future scholarly impact. In the years since, her contributions to the study of race, racial identity, and gender, literature, and drama have resulted in numerous publications in such journals as African American Review, American Literature, Theater Journal, and Genre, and in 3 books, 1 in press and 1 in progress. She has also been recognized by numerous distinguished fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Woodrow Wilson Fellowship Foundation, the Ford Foundation, and here at Stanford from the President's Fund, to name just a few. She's a sought-after speaker on topics of race, gender, and literature, both in the US and abroad, and has also managed to serve Stanford generously on numerous advisory boards as chair of the editorial board of the Stanford University Press and as director since 2007 of the program in African and African American Studies. Her teaching credentials are no less burnished. She has won teaching awards at 3 different universities, including, of course, Stanford. In our case, the St. Clair Drake Outstanding Teaching Award, both in 2004 and 2006, and also Teacher of the Year National Award from the Alpha Phi Foundation. Finally, though, Michele is one of those people whose mere presence energizes a campus. Her contagious enthusiasm, her bold insights on burning issues, and her enormous interest in students and literature make every interaction with her a pleasure. And so it is an honor and a wonderful privilege to be able to now turn you over to Professor Michele Elam.
I think I'm supposed to mic myself for the recording. Is that right? But it's, if not, I can project. Can you hear me? It's not coming through.
Just go straight to the tape.
Oh, okay.
But the podium should be working too.
Well, I'll just go ahead and start, actually. And I don't think this is on, but hopefully you can hear me as well. Can you hear me okay? Back there? Okay. So I wanted to thank Michele and the Center for Teaching and Learning for both hosting the session and inviting me. I know that a lot of people have already written and published on this subject of teaching race and gender. They're really hot, charged topics, of course, and teachers are often discussing how to deal with the high emotions and the political volatility of it. And I think those are all important topics, but they're actually not the ones that I'm going to talk about today. I'd like to turn to a related subject that has been more of an intellectual and pedagogical challenge for me, but it also feels more urgent to me right now. I felt first called to talk about the topic when I taught Introduction to Feminist Studies a couple of years ago. And there were over 40 students, but almost all of them, not all of them, but a good deal of them felt very uncomfortable ever using the word feminism, let alone identifying with it, even though they were taking the class. I think it was like a stealth class. So there were a lot of apologies for this, but they had admitted that even though they were interested in something like gender equity, to be called a feminist was to suspect some foul epithet had been sent your way. So, and that was when one of the students coined it for me. They said, this is the new F word, we can't use it. And it's this new millennial phenomenon, oh thank you, that fascinates me. And it's both the reason that I wanted to talk about it, and it's also precisely the way I also want to enter into both how I wanted to talk to you today about how I lecture, but also how I bring these topics up in the classroom itself. So it's sort of a meta conversation and talking about from the outset, which I do with the students, about why and how we do or do not talk about these issues, these sort of a priori conditions that can shape or eclipse the kinds of things we talk about even before we get to the classroom, and why that matters for them as well and for their education at Stanford. So it's partly going to be a little bit of a meta lecture, although I normally wouldn't lecture in this context too. But I wanted to model for you a little bit how I would approach these topics as well. So I'm going to have three main points today. One is the first focus is just why race and gender have become kind of unteachables. And specifically, I want to look at cultural examples of how race and gender are not represented as fields of study. And we're going to look at a couple short clips of Obama and Palin. And that's just arbitrary. I just pulled them up. There's so many out there, especially with this election season. The second topic is how race and gender are characterized increasingly as unspeakable. As one of my students put it yesterday, it's touchy, delicate, it's a total killjoy in polite society to bring it up, but at the same time it's also talked about compulsively and constantly in every corner of society, from politics to pop culture. And I'd like to analyze, though, also what is lost when we seed the ground of race and gender to any and all lay definitions, when we don't approach them as rich interdisciplinary fields of academic study as well. And the last section I'm going to be looking at is how race and gender are actually usable, how both can function as critical intellectual tools for social and literary analysis. So not just about how to teach them, but also to get them thinking critically about race and gender and what that teaches us as well. And for me, this is also to turn the conversation a little bit away from diversity as demographics, although that's incredibly important, but also thinking about the ways diversity involves intellectual contributions as well. And so to that end, at the very end, since I am a literature professor, I'm actually going to look at a very, very short little clips of literary examples of how race and gender can enrich our understanding of both literature and the social world around us. And I was always inspired by scholar-writer Toni Morrison, who, as she puts it in the Playing in the Dark, Whiteness in the Literary Imagination, not to speak of race, and I'd add also of gender, to insist, this is a quote from, that literature is not only universal, but race-free, risks lobotomizing that literature and diminishes both the art and the artist. In other words, my emphasis here, for me at least, and with my students, is that teaching race and gender isn't about advocacy or advancing a particular political agenda. It's in the service of good critical thinking, and as Morrison suggests further, it's simply in the service of good art. So let me begin right away with my first point. How is it that race and gender have become unteachable, or increasingly unteachable? And I pulled a clip from July 2010 Urban League address, and for President Obama actually suggests that meaningful conversations about race and discrimination would not occur at, as he puts it in here, a bunch of academic symposia or fancy commissions or panels, probably not here, in other words, but instead around, as he puts it, our kitchen tables and water coolers and church basements and in our schools and with our kids all across the country. So let's see if this works. Looks like it was moving.
Yes.
Sound? You ready to set? Where's my sound person?
Cable, sound, cable,
Sound person?
the cable.
Cable. We're supposed to have a hookup.
Can we lift your laptop?
I
to
can,
this
but
microphone?
I'm pretty sure you'll never hear.
If you put it to this
Oh.
microphone.
No, Mama. Where's David Lynch? This is about charade.
When a bogus controversy based on selected and deceiving excerpts of a speech led to her forced resignation. Now, many are to blame for the reaction and overreaction that followed these comments, including my own administration. What I said to Shirley was that the full story she was trying to tell, a story about overcoming our own biases and recognizing ourselves and folks who on the surface seem different, is exactly the kind of story we need to hear in America. It's exactly what we need to hear because we've all got our biases. And rather than jump to conclusions and point fingers, play some of the games that are played on cable TV, we should all look inward, try to examine what's in our own hearts. We should all make more of an effort to discuss with one another in a truthful and mature and responsible way the divides that still exist, the discrimination that's still out there, the prejudices that still hold us back, the discussion that needs to take place not on cable TV, not just through a bunch of academic symposia or fancy commissions or panels, not through political posturing, but around kitchen tables and water coolers and church basements and in our schools and with our kids all across the country.
All right, very good. I hope you heard some of that, because we have Palin coming next, and you really want to hear her. So I picked this actually because even though I'm in literature, one of the things that I really want the students to appreciate is that analyzing race and gender is a way of joining their scholarship also with their daily practice, with everyday events that look as if they're either uninterpretable or they sort of just absorb on their own. So as you heard, hopefully, Obama implied that the study of race is best left out of at least higher education. In the larger context of this quote, it's clear what he means by in the classroom. He means K through 12. Even as White House Press Secretary Robert Gibbs called racial controversies, and in this one he's referring to the firing of Agricultural Department employee Shirley Sherrod, he calls those teachable moments. So Obama on the one hand suggests that race in this case, and I'd extend it to gender, seems to have a different status than other objects of study and research. For many, the reason for this is that race studies, feminist studies are increasingly seen as harboring an activism at odds with disinterested intellectual inquiry. But students who see this clip are often struck by Obama's anti-intellectualism. After all, he says that in order not to play into media hype, he doesn't say reframe it in an academic conversation. He says we should look inward, we should try to examine what's in our hearts, we should make all of the effort to discuss one another in a truthful and mature and responsible way. The divides still exist and so on. Discrimination is out there. But one of the things that's so odd about it is why you have anti-intellectualism in the talk. The talk is actually entitled The Importance of Educational Reform. And he mentions schools, but as I said, he's also imagining kind of third grade. And he pointedly dismisses academic symposia. So curiously, the speech suggests that casual water cooler chats and middle school assignments are actually preferable vehicles to racial progress and social justice. He even suggests that getting there seems to involve these kind of vague prescriptives to be mature and responsible, as he puts it, sort of the Rodney King, can't we all get along appeal. And the call to examine our hearts rather than our heads, because they're set in odds in there, for contemplative self-reflection rather than critical dialogue, doesn't give us the language to analyze either this episode, the one with Sherrod, or Sharon Angle, or all the welter of other racialized moments just in this last election cycle. As one of my students noted, you're actually enjoined, when you watch this, to suspend critical thought when it comes to race, and that really interests me. What does that come from? Why would you settle for grammar school understandings of race and gender? And I'd like to give you another example of what just talking about race in this way yields or not. This one doesn't have sound. This is, how many of you have seen this play? Oh, you have? We really want to see it. I'll talk to you about that after this. David Mamet, famous playwright, has a new play out. And in an article, We Can't Stop Talking About Race in the New York Times, recently, he was sort of opining on the topic of his new play, simply titled Race. And in it, he argues that race relations are really just like marital relations, in which each turn takes advantage of its political strength, and which each, as he puts it, quote, both at times are, different times are bitching, and both different times are bailing, but we're all in the same boat, and like, quote, any marital fight, the dialogue will have run its natural course. As in a marriage, the dialogue takes its own course until fatigue, remorse, and finally forgiveness bring resolution. I don't know if he's married or not, but the problem with this kind of talk, actually, is in which, in the absence of any theoretical language about how race and sex works in our culture, and he borrows this trope of marriage, or his version of marriage, which ends up replacing civil rights history, struggle relations, power relations with this idea of this inexorable, very natural cycle in which parties somehow equally change places over time. He talks about that in Article 2. They both have power, blacks and whites. They just recycle it through time. And the race problem will eventually just work itself out in marital equilibrium. So for Mamet, this trope of race relations as lovers leads him to claim, sort of cynically, I think, most contemporary debate on race is nothing but sanctimony, efforts at exploitation and efforts at restitution seeking equally to enlarge and prolong dissent and rancor, end quote. And I think that's another impediment to teaching race, because their attitude is you're bringing it up and you're just exacerbating the condition. You're being divisive. And I note Mamet also because it seems to me that he feels perfectly legitimized to opine on race, to reach for his own idiosyncratic metaphor of marriage, to explain the processes of race, and to dismiss debates about it as merely maritable spats, because it's not seen as an academic subject, not something you have to learn about or understand in more depth. It's not like physics. Anybody feels like they can weigh in, even though the implications and stakes of them are very high. So there's a casual license to talk about race. It's rather like a hobby or sport. But because of that, there's also a great exhaustion when one raises the race of gender or race in the university classroom. That's also worth acknowledging and challenging, I think, from the beginning. Alan Crepenzano, who's a scholar of South African fiction, talks about the narrative exhaustion that's associated with race in South Africa, the way that people speak about it all the time. It becomes a genre of outrage in itself, and you get the sense that talking is an end in itself. And unlike every other subject, that somehow it won't improve under scrutiny or it won't benefit from scholarship or study. It's just sort of this thing we do all constantly. That's also something to address and sort of deal with in the classroom, I think. I think this is increasingly true with discussions about gender and feminism that also make them unteachables, and I want to give you this clip about the new feminism, because actually, apart from the introduction to feminist class, it's this speech, one of many by Palin, who's claiming a new kind of feminism, that I want to share with you as well, too. In part because she also shares with Obama this one thing, which is this anti-intellectualism, too. So let's see if we can. And again, these are, I realize they're political topics, But when we're analyzing them, we're not choosing left or right. I mean, that's part of the whole project. So let me see if I can get this one up.
And I thank VSA List 2 for being a home to a new conservative feminist movement, is how I look at this. It's an
Oh, sorry, guys. Yes, help. I think I'll move this one over there. David, help. Techie. I'm going to move this closer so we can actually. This is part of my pedagogical tactic to keep you on your seat.
It's working.
Yeah. There's a cable there.
That was not relevant.
Wasn't? It's not the audio cable.
And I thank VSA List 2 for being a home to a new conservative feminist movement, is how I look at this. It's an emerging conservative feminist identity. Far too long, when people heard the word feminist, they thought of the faculty lounge at some East Coast women's college, right? And no offense to them, they have their opinions and their voice, and God bless them, they're just great. But that's not the only voice of women in America. I'd like to remind people of another feminist tradition, kind of a Western feminism. It's influenced by the pioneering spirit of our foremothers who went in wagon trains across the wilderness, and they settled in homesteads. And these were tough, independent, pioneering mothers whose work was as valuable as any man's on the frontier. And it's no surprise that our western states that gave women the vote, the right to vote, way before their East Coast sisters in a more genteel city perhaps got it right. These women, they had dirt under their fingernails, and they could shoot a gun and push a plow and raise a family all at the same time. These women, our frontier foremothers, they loved this country, and they made sacrifices to carve out a living and a family life out of the wilderness. They went where no woman had gone before. I kind of feel a connection to that tough, gun-toting pioneer feminism of women like Annie Oakley in them. Maybe it's that upbringing in Alaska. Maybe too, it's because later on today I do a speech for the NRA and kind of getting in the groove.
Okay. So students will hear this all the time, and I actually think they're perfect occasions for analyzing a little bit. I actually see her reclamation and reinvention of feminism as directly related to my students' unease and unwillingness to use the F word. Feminism, gender, race is everywhere, but it's seen as off the table for intellectual discussion. But not making race and gender a topic for academic analysis usually means either recycling and naturalizing antiquated or commercialized ideas of gender, usually the concession to the idea of feminism as man-hating, bra-burning. But in Palin's speech, actually, she's doing something else, I think, with the vacating of feminist meaning. Like Obama, she takes a swipe at academics or East Coast feminists, I guess, women's studies departments, but she's also reinventing feminism and associating with at least what she sees as frontier values, guns, motherhood, a sort of I can bring home the bacon and fry it up in the pan sensibility. I thought that went out in the 70s, but I guess it's back. And she suggests, though, out-feminizes the blue-stocking feminists back east. While teaching a cultural text like this, my interest isn't in recuperating a true feminism. I don't want to wrest it from Palin or correct her, although I did go back and check and see whether or not the Western states had extended suffrage rights to women before back east. So there are a little state amendments where I was checking her. We were like rolling our eyes at that when we heard it, but it's actually true. But what's interesting to me for her is that it's in the way she, this excerpt for me, flags the endless reinvention and usability of race and gender for specific ends, and I think that's where we can find pedagogical opportunity and value, because her anti-intellectualism redefines feminism in order to reimagine it for her own purposes. So in this way, she's actually capitalizing on this idea of the usefulness of gender identity as a category, and it's a really interesting, I think, helpful way to start to analyze gender. That is, not just as a standalone identity, but how it gets used, how it gets employed, how gender is done, and to what ends. And we often talk about the constraints of race and gender, and students often go there pretty quickly too, about the need to just get over race or gender. And my goal, and here too, you'll sort of see that I'm not using race studies theory or jargon, and that's partly because although at some point I will introduce them to the sort of interdisciplinary approaches to race as well, I really start off with just a couple excerpts of usually artist scholars with a term or something that gives them some traction about how to think critically about it, because my point is actually to get them excited and seeing how this serves their own ends and interests, intellectual ends and interests as well. Let me turn to another one too. So one of those, for example, that Harry and I use in our IHUM class, we have an IHUM class called Beyond Survival. Did we add the race gender too? Yeah, I'll tell you that story. We used to have race and gender in the title, and we ended up taking it out. But it's called Beyond Survival, but we have, I think, 3 of the 4 writers are of color. And this is Lorraine Hansberry, of course, famous playwright. But one of the things I find useful, and this hooks up with Palin's point, is this idea of race as a device. And one of her points is that even though race is used, and it's a lie in the sense that it's a social construction and a fiction, that doesn't mean that it isn't real. And her work and others are attempts to acknowledge and name and to theorize the many means to which race as a device is put, to recognize the compelling realities of the lie. But there's also more productive ways, not that that's not productive, there's also ways to see the uses of race in a positive way. So that is to go beyond in a class simply excavating racial stereotyping, which is a kind of dull project after a while. There's a lot more interesting things to be done with analyzing race and gender. And so, for instance, in analyzing race and gender in something like Palin's speech, we analyze it to get at not the lie, but the utility of the concepts, which is, I think, in the end, a much more productive endeavor in the classroom. And I'll return to her at the end as well. I've been referencing cultural and political examples, but of course I teach literature, and I also wanted to turn to just what we do or what we can do with representations of race and gender in the humanities. Looking at their intersections, I think, can give us, that is the intersectionality of race and gender, can give us the critical language to analyze both social relations and aesthetic engagements in literature. And here's a little excerpt from Harriet Jacobs. Actually, these are very, very short little pieces. How many of you have read Harriet Jacobs' Slave Narrative? Oh, okay, a few people. Everyone in our IHUM class too. So this is one little excerpt. The main character, her persona, is talking in the excerpt in a way to try and explain how women's rights are always racialized. And she's explained to her audience here, to the white women, that she's trying to mobilize to abolish slavery, why she slept with a white man as a way to prevent being raped by her master. And her confession, that is having to actually put in print the unsayable, we've been talking about what can't be said and said, reveals sexual details that she knows very well may alienate her audience. But it also functions as a form of social commentary. So it's both an apology for having transgressed the conventions of womanhood to keep herself pure, as she talks later, but it's also a critique of the racially exclusive nature of those conventions and of white women's freedoms more generally. She goes on and says, if slavery had been abolished, I too could have married the man of my choice, and I too could have had a home shielded by laws. And she goes through this whole litany of identification from which she's excluded by virtue of her race. It's at a time when you have the rise of what Karen Sanchez-Ebler calls the feminist abolitionist movement. So they occur right in tandem there, which is partly why I wanted to pick it. But for students, I think what's more interesting sometimes than the whole idea of the historical rise of abolitionism and feminism, or even the critique of feminism at the point, is that the idea that race matters in the very initial exercise of women's rights. And that sometimes freedom is not simply this idea of free exercise of choice, but it's on a continuum of choice and constraint as well. So it gets them to these higher order issues and questions as well right away. And this is something to keep in mind when we come back to Palin too. Morrison also suggests subtler ways that understandings of race and gender aren't simply revealed through content, that is, in this case with Jacobs, where she's explicitly calling out her white sisters, but also through form, and sometimes by what's revealed by what's not said, by what's unsaid. And this is one of my favorite quotes about it too, because I think this is one of the harder things to do in racial and gender analysis, when it doesn't look like people of color are in the room or racial issues are being thematized or enacted. But you have the dim sense that they are, and there actually are critical apparatuses to think about and talk about them. So one example, very short example, is from The Awakening, which is a feminist text. When I was in college, I was taught that this was like the uber feminist text at the turn of the century. A white woman's sexual coming of age. She's very bored with sort of bourgeois conventions. She's in the South. On Grand Isle, which of course was decimated just recently. But so she lives down there, and it was always taught to me as the exercise of her freedom, and this was sort of an example of it. But of course it's really problematic because her ennui, her boredom with the conventions, her coming into her independence in the South, she never notices the whole stable, literally, of quadroon nannies she has taking care of her children, taking care of the house, taking care of her husband. So they do perform some of the labor, which is the context for her awakening. More than that, they actually function as sort of exotic others that inspire her sexually. She associates women of color, women from the South. Are you remembering it too? Yeah, with women who she sees as libidinal and sexually exciting and beyond the pale. And so she also symbolically identifies with them as well. So she also uses them in that way as well. And the point for me is that she's dependent on both the labor and the imaginative associations that she makes with the women of color in the text isn't so much of a critique of the racism in feminism. I think that's where people go sometimes. And actually, I had one of my first articles as a graduate student was published on this piece, and I got all this blowback from people who said, you're taking down our icon. And I was just a graduate student. I was like, I was so sorry. I had no idea. But I also realized I had something else in mind with the project, which was that the foundation of a white woman's coming of age in here was absolutely centrally connected to the disappearing and the absenting of the women of color that she was actually dependent on. And that was really interesting to me. Like, what are the conditions whereby you can imagine yourself free and liberated? And the narrative is interesting because it documents Edna, the main character, her unseeing. I mean, in the narrative, the women appear there. They're in the text, but Edna doesn't see them. And that's one of the wonderful things about literature, that it lets you see that double seeing. It lets you see what the character doesn't. And it's an invitation, I think, to actually speculate and self-reflect on things as well, not to take anything away from Edna as well. So with that, I actually, that was the other thing, too, that I thought is important. The takeaway for some of the students, then, is to think about human rights or ideals, abstract ideals of justice, the ways in which they're always gendered, always racialized, and that's not necessarily a drawback. That might actually be the conditions for their making that warrants examination. What I do in a class then is, so you have Race as a Device from Lorraine Hansberry, this notion of things not necessarily there. How does Morrison put it? Things that aren't there aren't necessarily not, things that are unseen are not necessarily not there. And those two terms alone actually can help us when we look at Palin. I'm a little afraid to show her again. But I wanted you to conjure Palin's feminism again. At the end. This is where I would actually, I think I will show her again, because I'm interested in your responses to it. What's unseen and what's unspoken in Palin's new imagining of feminism? The way in which her feminism of frontier mothers is a history that can't include Jacob's, probably, because they both have dirt under their nails, but probably from very different reasons. Can't account for slavery in the history of Western expansionism, these women. Let me just show her briefly, too, again, or if people can. Do you think it's too much to try? I do have my own assistant here. See.
And I thank the SBA List, too, for being a home to a new conservative feminist movement, is how I look at this. It's an emerging conservative feminist identity. Far too long, when people heard the word feminist, they thought of the faculty lounge at some East Coast women's college, right?
It's okay.
And no offense to them. They have their opinions and their voice, and God bless them. They're just great. But that's not the only voice of women in America. I'd like to remind people of another feminist tradition, kind of a Western feminism. It's influenced by the pioneering spirit of our foremothers who went in wagon trains across the wilderness, and they settled in homesteads. And these were tough, independent, pioneering mothers whose work was as valuable as any man's on the frontier. And it's no surprise that our western states that
Okay, I'm going to pause her right there because I am really interested. So this makes possible certain ideas of feminism. So what are some of those ideas of feminism? What is she advocating for feminism? We can hear that. The motherhood. Right, so the ideal of motherhood too. You know, what's the positive about that? What does that enable? Oh, come on. It enables some things. That ideal of motherhood, of reproductive capacity, has long been valued as something for that's unique to women, that's distinctive to women. So what's the critique of that, though, too? That's y'all in the post-feminist movement.
Biological determinism.
The biological.
Determinism.
I don't know biological determinism, but it certainly locates women's, you know, possibilities and agencies in their bodies, right, in their biology, exactly. Not everybody can have a baby. Not everybody wants to have a baby. Maybe that's not where we want to put the site of our greatest agency, is reproductive capacities too, right? What else is omitted or included in here? What's unsaid here? Okay.
A lot of the women didn't have a choice when they were going to the whole thing.
Right, we just looked at Harriet Jacobs too, the sense that not everybody gets to travel, right? So there's that sense of opportunity or a movement westward. She's actually joined it to the movement westward, that frontier expansionism, like with Cooper and that ideal that people love too, right? So it doesn't, but you don't think that when you're first watching it. You think, yeah, you know, the wagons and all of that. Yeah, what were you gonna say? Sure.
I was just going to say, too, that it doesn't suggest that a certain proportion of these women were immigrant women.
Oh, no.
And
No, because they loved America. That was the other thing too. It's very, and somehow we said, imagine their mood. She could have created that vision, actually, because the people who actually were traveling westward themselves had many complications. The way she cast them here, they had equal rights with men, right? And they loved America, and that trumps everything, right? But the actual history, it's really interesting. Yeah.
She leaves out Native Americans.
Yes. Well. As is almost every narrative history too, right? I can imagine it a different kind of inclusive one, because at least to the degree they're left out, that they're not on those wagons, right? They're probably not like on the wagons, right? I mean, I think that's a great point. The ellipses in it. Do I see a hand? Oh, yeah. I have to pick you because you helped me with this. Yeah.
So speaking to what's left out, it's
Yes.
left out that if reproduction is seen as something that requires a certain level of effort and work and things that need to be done, that's something that men don't have to worry about.
Oh, I think that's great. So feminism doesn't extend to men in the project of.
Well, that the agency that one has in reproduction can therefore lead to a lack of agency elsewhere.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. Well, I took it two ways. One, I don't know if people can hear. I do one man in a chair. Doesn't have a chair. But the sense that it looks like it's only women's efforts and it's not men's efforts too. And of course, one of the things too for feminism has been a matter of, or gender equity or whatever you want to call it, is that it's not exclusive to women. Maybe that goes to biological determinism. That it's also a larger social and cultural project that everybody should potentially be engaged in. So in its emphasis and pride in womanhood, of a certain kind of womanhood, it can narrow and leave out different stories, different opportunities, and so on. And if you're not gun-toting, you know, there's that you might be left out there too. Yeah.
And I actually think by separating the sexes or whatever, you're leaving out partnership, which then brings you to equals, or hopefully brings you to equals. And I think that can be a major mistake.
Partnership
In these new adventures, in family support, in farming, everything, hunting, everything they did as culture originally, way back, became partners together in the daily chores of whatever was hunting and picking grains and all that kind of stuff, was the family together out of necessity. This starts to separate.
Yeah, I'm wondering if that should be, I'd love to have her in the room and talk to her about that. This sort of prelapsarian notion of when we all work together kind of thing too. That I don't know quite, I mean, it would be, you know, from what I know of women's history, they didn't have equal status, or they were pressed into service for doing it too. But I like your point about partnerships and community, because it does suggest that also, not besides a heteronormative nuclear family ideal as a sort of model for feminist partnerships, but the larger community, the people who are dropped out, you actually don't see it necessarily there too. Yeah.
You just listen to it as a literal there are nobody in the wagon but the mom.
Well, see,
Maybe the baby, but
Yeah,
there's nobody else in the
Yeah.
wagon.
yeah.
Somebody's absent, obviously.
There's a few absences. I think that's a great point too. Yes.
It also seems that it's such a lovely, beautiful picture, and the hardship and the pain and loss, that live long, who has died.
Yeah. Well, you're a downer, obviously. No, that's what I don't want to hear. You're not in that campaign. Right. I mean, unfortunately, that's partly why we want. No, you're absolutely right. All the things that you're talking about left out. I actually want. I try. I mean, it's hard with different audiences with Palin to actually get them to see what's also productive about what she's creating too. Because I actually think it's really clever and smart the way she takes certain dimensions like out-feminizes feminists to say that we had this whole big critique that you can't be the mother and you can't do all these other kinds of things at the same time, and so she's suggesting that her project actually trumps them. She hooks it up to the American tenets of individualism and all that sort of stuff too. But one of the things is that then the response to that is, look what you've left out, history, oppression, politics, no one wants to hear that, and that goes to this exhaustion of the race talk that I think when you're teaching race becomes a problem, because it sounds like you're a naysayer and you're negative and we don't want to invite you over for dinner and cocktails.
Yeah. Well, it's class that is also, it's a class issue and empowerment, and of course being away from Washington D.C. Right? I mean, so you're not waiting for them to take care of you. You do it yourself.
Right.
So,
The sort of independence. Yeah. No, I think that's a great point. You said something right before, and I just forgot what it was.
The class.
The class.
Yeah.
That's the other thing, is that actually, I mentioned race and gender, and of course, women's studies, gender studies has always now been looking at all of these different variables and the different saliencies at different times too. So there are a couple things that I give you about literature that's so wonderful is some come into relief at other times, but if you actually start to analyze them in their particularity, then I think it's very helpful. Class is always off the table in American society. They don't even have a way, they don't have a good way of talking about it. Either it's a euphemism like social positionality or something like that, but it's very interesting to think about it in terms of Harriet Jacobs, for instance, too, how those things. And I actually think race and gender, talking about them and clearing space for why we're not often allowed to talk about, is helpful talking about class, too. Because we don't want to talk about class, because it sounds like we have social mobility, either westward or upward, and so that interrupts a narrative that students too, hold very dear. And so, when you're teaching stuff that's running up against things that aren't even fully articulated, but people just know they don't want to hear, that makes for a class of 40 plus in a feminist studies class of students who don't want to talk about feminist studies. They really want it, but they're not really sure. Yeah.
Well, as a historian, I was thinking what complicates her revision of this history of moving westward is she left out the Mormons. Or moving westward at the same time.
Right, so you can see Eagles in America for that. Yeah, exactly. No, there's much, but all of narratives omit a lot in order to do, and I think actually, I think it's helpful. I think you took Morrison to heart, which is, and for students, I think sometimes that can be helpful too. We can both critique what she's doing, but then it falls into opinion. I like or I don't like what she said. Another way of looking at it is, where do race and gender emerge here to help craft and construct and buttress her particular kind of feminism? And I think that's really helpful. And that's sort of where I wanted to end, which was just that those were some of the sights and stakes of teaching for me, the Unteachables of Race. I think the Palin thing gives you the sense that for the F word at least, for feminism, you either use it or you lose it. Thank you. Too, and because of all the SUS activities that are going on, one of the things that we were discussing that comes up a lot is where and when to teach race too. Do you teach it in a single class? You have one class on it. You have CCSRE and classes, or do you teach it integrated across the curriculum? And at least for me, I think both models are important. Both integrated across the curriculum, I think that's absolutely essential. We're trying to do that both with Race Forward. There's all sorts of collaborations across the university. But I also think there's some value in having a race studies class. So people remember, you can't just take it up casually. I mean, you can, no one's stopping you, but there's so much research and fabulous work out there on how race works as a social process, and gender for that matter as well, that I would also suggest having separate classes. And independent classes, dedicated classes. And then the last thing I just wanted, because I was just reminded again too of Stanford's very unique because you have in Arizona trying to doing away with ethnic studies departments, which I'm sure has galvanized more people to become majors than ever before. There was all this conversation in the Chronicle of Higher Education that Black studies is past its prime and it's going to die of its own inertia and weight. And then if it was so, impotent, you wonder why they went after ethnic studies departments. But here we actually have the Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity, which has all sorts of affiliations with immigration studies and urban studies and public policy and education. Instead of the closing of feminist studies, you have this joining of power with the Clayman Institute, and they just have to give a little shout out for those because there's an amazing Beyond the Stalled Revolution with Laura Carstensen, Deborah Rhodey, Estelle Friedman, Maya Strober, and Shelley Carell, and that's at 4:45, 4:15, 4:15, that's what it, yes, I had, anyway, we're not, I think in academia we're going in different directions a little bit, whether or not they're actually supporting discussions of race and gender, or whether or not they're starting to foreclose them too, so I think we're very lucky here, too. I think we have a couple times, I know people have to go to class and stuff, but if anyone has questions, yeah.
You talked in general about how you help motivate students to get interested in discussing race in the classroom, but I think one of the fears about teaching race is what do you do with a belligerent student, or what do you do in the moment when students act in uncivil ways? And I was wondering if, in your experience, if you had any reflections about how you dealt with those moments, or what works in those moments.
I have actually, all of you who've taught race and gender know that's actually usually the subject of the conversation. How do you do management of students? And actually, I don't think I ever have trouble motivating them, but I think someone defined it to me as sort of extracurricular, or what to do with the emotions, high emotions. And since I'm not a therapist, and since a lot of this requires therapy, I used to go the other extreme, which was I sort of intellectualized it entirely in some ways, because people's emotions were so high, and so my response to that is like conflict avoidant, we'll just change the subject. But obviously that's not true. So somehow now, I think now that there's a way in which people become very passionately committed to these things. I mean, these things matter to us, and I don't want to purge us of that, our racial, religious commitments, whatever. So they really matter. It's just that what I do now is I stop it if it's suspending the critical analyses that they would normally do with a text too. Because that's what happens, is that some people, like with, for instance, Mamet, not to name him, I'm afraid of being taped for this reason, because I actually like Mamet's plays, but this, when he talks about this, I think it's problematic, so that I would go back and say, it's fine to use this image of marriage, but why are you not borrowing from the scholarship we're using now? Or what are the implications of saying that racial struggle is just something that people are going to work out between themselves, or like a lovers or a spat or something like that. So push them a little bit on the choice of the language, the critical language that they're using. I've actually never, in 20 years of teaching, had students jump on each other. It's the other way. They're so overly civil, or they're passive aggressive and say, I can't, I don't know the politically correct term to use, which I also am very impatient with. It's not about political correctness at all. It's how we're actually going to talk and work together. So I actually find the students are, I don't know, maybe it's something, I don't know. Have you had the student who actually blew up in class or something?
Not here.
Yeah. I remember when I was a grad student, we used to have men not come to the feminist studies class, and it was that big of a, but I have had men in my feminist studies class, and men don't seem to have any problem understanding themselves in terms of engaged in struggle for voice. Yeah. Yes, my dear. Yes.
So, a lot of us who take identity sort of studies classes, whether it's queer studies or race studies or feminist studies, find that, as we delve sort of deeper and deeper into the theory and methodology, that sometimes, a lot of us are also engaged in activism outside of class, and sometimes that huge sort of array of theory becomes paralyzing in a way. You're always sort of hyper aware of how you're handling yourself in a situation, and meta-analyzing how it's racialized or gendered, as opposed to just sort of acting.
I wish I talked to you before. I should always talk to you before, actually. But I think that's an interesting question, because I actually think that's some of the pushback too, which is I'm overthinking it. But why don't we say that about math? Or social science. So there is you're right. I mean, we become much more critically aware in our daily practice. But it's probably someone told you you're overthinking this, or, you're not, I mean, when you go to movies, when you first do film analysis, and you start to critique the male gaze, or, I mean, you get a lot of pushback a lot of people actually do. So I actually don't think, I think there's two issues. One is, I wouldn't critically suspend your meta stuff as you're going on, any more than you would about anything else. But the other thing, that I just forgot because it just crashed out there. It was very important, but, I completely forgot what it was. Wait, say again what you just said.
Well, basically
Theory, about theory. Yes, so the tension between theory and practice is actually something you see a lot in African American studies too, and gender studies too. And so there was these big debates in the 80s whether or not theory, which comes in as superimposes, is actually interrupting feminist practice. So the cool thing about feminist studies and gender studies and a lot of race studies is they've taken some of these theories that did look like they themselves often harbored racialized ideas of the subject that then got superimposed and reproduced all the systems of inequity that nobody were, they were problematic. And then developing theories that also joined with practice and scholarship. So it wasn't just a whole body of canonical information that you had to learn and absorb and was intimidating. So that led to challenges of academia and institutions as well. The sort of challenge that you sit in a classroom, it's yet one other subject you have to learn, and then you sort of internalize it and then you go forth. And so a lot of feminist and gender studies combines those things or recreated new theories, new theoretical models. That it's not going to stop you from having to learn some theory necessarily. But that was a big sense in the 80s that theory was just a kind of white Western intimidating, thing that was another form of oppression. And so the response to it largely, I think, was, the most creative response, I think, was creating new models of inquiry that were really helpful. Yes.
So I wanted to speak about the belligerent student, which I don't really meet here at Stanford, but I've been in situations where there was a belligerent student, and I think that is the biggest learning opportunity for everybody that can possibly happen. And in fact, I think the thing that I do here to bring up belligerence and conversation is to say something from myself, or I've been wrong.
See, I'm not in the confessional mode. I'm not into
own
doing
racist,
that.
You
what?
my own racist.
Well, but see, that's the
things,
crash
but I'm just
approach.
saying, to put myself forward like that
Yeah.
is to me the way to, I don't want to say disappear it, but people are able to air what is not being said.
Well, so people have lots of different approaches to how to deal with the issues too. I actually think on the issue of civility versus belligerence, it's actually overcoming civility. The sharing that we're all racist thing is what I didn't like about Crash, to tell you the truth. But I think you're right. It can sometimes inoculate people and make them feel, the film Crash, right? Make them feel safer. But to me, that's to put I don't do that in any other academic study. And I don't think my personal confession, that isn't the role that I feel comfortable taking it. I think it puts the question back into the hearts and minds and interrogating the racism within us and all of that. And that I think that as a pedagogical technique, I know I'm a wonderful teacher, so I know it works. It doesn't, and that actually speaks to, I hope, with something like this as a talk, I don't have any further insight than any of you in what works better, and I don't think there is one particular way of doing it. So for me, I like it framed not as a conversation in the washroom, in the private room, in our hearts. I don't know where that is. I think that sometimes it needs to continue to be a passionate, committed academic subject with really broad stakes for everybody, but one in which that we should subject to rigorous critical inquiry, just like we do everything else, too. Hopefully. Thank you. Thank you. Great.
Is there one more question?
Yeah.
I was gonna ask you about the concept, like Obama was saying, of confronting race sort of outside of the classroom, and places where that might happen at Stanford University, whether it's in like ethnic themed dorms or in kind of race exclusive type clubs, and whether you think that's beneficial or not to our advancements of the conversations about race and feminism.
I was just talking to Nana Beebe in my class in another global Harlem Renaissance, asked the same sort of thing. He felt like sometimes the conversations about race within the classroom were either so historically distant, like reading Zora Neale Hurston in a masterpieces class, but it's removed. It's good analysis, but it's sort of removed. And then the difficulty of making that connection to what's happening in the class with the conversations with the dorms outside. And my hope is that the connection between, say, cultural centers or the dorms and what happens in academic classes there'll be a continuous loop. So next time you see something like this and you're in your dorm and you're talking about it, you can, and not just her, you should pick subjects that, people that you agree with, people you don't agree with, any kind of cultural phenomenon that you happen to see, that it's sort of got that everyday quality that you just sort of say something snarky about and go on. Here you could bring your analysis to bear, and I know you could do this, Kyle, because from the mixed race class, all the stuff on racial formation, all the stuff we talked about, community building, all of that stuff, then you bring and ask, more critical, I think sharper questions, more intelligent questions. My main thing is just having some language to talk about it. Sometimes people feel so uneasy and they're so inarticulate about it. It's like because it's suddenly in the language of affect and feeling instead of critical analysis, which is what we should combine them. I mean, passionate feeling analysis. I guess we should, I can talk to people independently.
Okay, all right, well, thank you so much,
everybody.
Michele, for speaking.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.